In the spring of 2008, Little Rock, Arkansas, was waking from a dull winter with the slow return of warmth and green. The city's streets remained quiet in the early hours, save for the occasional bus or the hum of garbage trucks winding through residential neighborhoods. In a modest apartment complex on the southern edge of the city, Michelle Harper woke each morning before sunrise. Her room was small and functional, with bare walls, a single window that looked out over a cracked parking lot, and a digital clock that always seemed to glow too brightly in the dark. Her mornings were ritualistic: make the bed, prepare a cup of coffee, tie her hair back, and put on her uniform. Her badge, keys, and steel-toed boots waited by the door like silent companions. Michelle had worked as a corrections officer at the state penitentiary for nearly 12 years. It was a job she hadn't dreamed of, but one she had grown into. She wasn't tall, but she was sturdy, with a steady gaze and a posture that discouraged small talk. At the prison, she moved through corridors of iron bars and fluorescent lighting with practiced efficiency. Her colleagues respected her, though few knew much about her beyond the job. She rarely joined them for lunch or after-shift drinks. There were always excuses: a headache, errands, a long drive home. In truth, Michelle had grown accustomed to solitude. Not by choice, but by repetition. Her apartment was silent when she returned each evening. The television was rarely on. Sometimes she played old jazz records while she cooked frozen dinners. The walls were adorned with framed photographs, family reunions, a younger version of herself in a graduation gown, her late mother holding a pie on Thanksgiving. But those moments felt like echoes from a past life, no longer tied to the rhythm of her current existence. She had tried. She had truly tried to build something beyond her job. Over the years, she dipped her toe into dating, co-workers, men from church, even a few awkward online connections. Each one began with cautious hope and ended in disappointment. One man had a drinking problem he refused to acknowledge. Another was charming until he grew bored. There was a married man who lied with ease, and a single father who introduced her to his children too soon and vanished just as quickly. Each time, Michelle gave a little more of herself, and each time, she was left with a little less. Eventually, the effort began to feel pointless. She was tired of adjusting her schedule, pretending to laugh at dull jokes, or waiting for a call that never came. The final straw had come 2 years prior, when a man she had grown close to, one who spoke of marriage and shared dreams, left town overnight, taking money she had lent him and leaving behind nothing but a half-used bottle of cologne in her bathroom. That betrayal hardened something inside her. She had closed that chapter, locked it away with a quiet resolve, and focused on what she could control. She became the go-to officer for night shifts and high-risk inmates. Supervisors praised her work ethic. She was known for her calm under pressure, her reliability, her refusal to engage in prison gossip. Some called her cold. Others admired her professionalism. Michelle heard it all and let it pass over her. The walls she built were thick, not out of pride, but survival. She no longer wanted to explain herself, no longer cared to justify her choices. Being alone felt safer. On her days off, she wandered the local flea markets, browsed used bookstores, or took long walks around Lake Maumelle. Sometimes she watched couples laugh on benches, families picnic on patches of sunlit grass. A part of her still longed for connection, but it was buried beneath layers of disillusionment. She told herself that some people simply weren't meant for love, that maybe she was one of them. Love, she believed, was for others, people who hadn't been worn down by the weight of rejection. Michelle's only constant companion was her dog, Toby, a quiet old beagle who followed her around the apartment and slept at her feet. She spoke to him in passing, fed him carefully measured portions, and let him sit beside her while she read. Toby never asked for more than she could give. His presence was simple and steady. As weeks blended into months, Michelle's life took on a mechanical quality. She woke, worked, returned, and repeated. Her routine was predictable, but not unpleasant. She didn't seek excitement anymore. She avoided the chaos that once tempted her. Her nights were quiet, her mornings calm. She had learned to let go of hope, not out of bitterness, but acceptance. Outside her apartment, the city shifted and stirred. People fell in love, broke up, moved away, started families. But inside her small world, Michelle stood still. She wasn't waiting for anything to change. She had chosen the loop she lived in. It was safer than dreaming. It was easier than believing again. In the depths of her heart, a small ember of longing still flickered. But it was faint and fragile, buried beneath a lifetime of letdowns. Michelle Harper no longer believed in second chances. She believed in quiet mornings, steady work, and the comfort of knowing what tomorrow would bring. Until the day came when all of that would begin to unravel. In the summer of 2008, while the heat pressed down on Little Rock like a wet cloth, a case emerged that would send tremors through the state's justice system. His name was Daniel Rose, a man whose face would soon appear on every news channel and morning headline. To the public, he had been a nobody, an unremarkable figure working at a used car lot on the outskirts of town. His smile in old photos was plain, his voice soft in interviews, but the accusations against him painted a picture far more sinister. The investigation began with the disappearance of a local waitress named Eliza Hart. She had last been seen leaving her shift at a diner just off Interstate 30. Her car was found 2 days later, abandoned in a Walmart parking lot with the keys still in the ignition. The police at first suspected a domestic issue or a planned escape. But then another woman went missing, Sandra Klein, a nursing student, and the similarities were undeniable. Both women were in their early 20s, lived alone, had no history of running away, and both vanished without a trace. By the time the third victim was discovered, the case had escalated into a full-blown manhunt. Her name was Clarissa Jones. Her body was found in a wooded area behind a storage facility, carefully hidden beneath a layer of pine needles and plastic sheeting. The condition of the body was horrifying. She had been bound, her mouth taped, and her skin marked with signs of prolonged restraint. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Forensic teams noted disturbing similarities with an earlier unsolved case from another county. Patterns emerged. The victims had been abducted at night, transported to a secondary location, and subjected to prolonged captivity before their deaths. There were no signs of forced entry in their homes, leading investigators to believe they had been lured or caught off guard. Media coverage exploded. The fear that a serial killer was operating within city limits spread quickly. Tips flooded the police department, most of them useless. The public was terrified, and pressure mounted to find a suspect. Eventually, it was a traffic stop that brought Daniel Rose into the spotlight. He had been pulled over for a broken taillight in the early hours of the morning. Inside his car, the officer noticed tools, ropes, gloves, and a large roll of plastic wrap. Rose was calm, explained he was helping a friend move. But the unease lingered. His plates were run, his name flagged. He was brought in for questioning. What followed was a cascade of revelations. His home, a small rental house in a quiet cul-de-sac, became a crime scene. In the basement, investigators uncovered hidden compartments, restraints bolted to the wall, and traces of blood confirmed to match 2 of the missing women. Behind a false panel in the garage, they found a stack of personal items, jewelry, hair ties, a purse. Each object matched one of the reported victims. It was more than circumstantial. It was undeniable. Daniel Rose maintained his innocence. He claimed he was being framed, that the evidence had been planted. He appeared composed during interrogations, answering questions clearly, never displaying aggression or panic. But the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage from gas stations and ATMs placed him near the locations where women had disappeared. Witnesses remembered his car. One woman came forward and described a chilling encounter. She said Rose offered her a ride late at night and grew agitated when she refused. The trial began in early 2009. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' families, and members of the public desperate for justice. Prosecutors presented their case with brutal precision: crime scene photos, DNA analysis, behavioral profiles. The jury listened in stunned silence as expert after expert testified to the methods used, the duration of captivity, the psychological control exerted by the killer. They spoke of calculated cruelty, of a man who planned each abduction with care and relished the fear he instilled. Daniel's defense team tried to cast doubt. They suggested contamination of evidence, misconduct by officers, misidentification. But the strategy failed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. For murders, 3 kidnappings, and multiple charges of unlawful imprisonment. The sentence was death by lethal injection. In prison, Daniel Rose was transferred to the death row unit. He became inmate number 547891, confined to a single cell in a quiet corridor of concrete and steel. He received no visitors, answered no mail, and requested no appeals. Guards noted his strange calmness. He read books, kept to himself, and never engaged in outbursts or arguments. He spoke politely when addressed but offered little else. To some, it was the behavior of a man who had accepted his fate. To others, it was the final act of a manipulator who had never shown his true face. Among his few personal items was a worn paperback copy of Crime and Punishment. It sat on the edge of his bed, pages bent from use. Occasionally, he wrote in a small black notebook, the contents of which remained private. The other inmates rarely saw him. Death row was isolating by design. The silence in that wing was broken only by the distant clang of doors and the occasional low voice from a guard. Daniel Rose became a ghost in the system, known, feared, but barely seen. His name still lingered in headlines, whispered in courtrooms and homes across Arkansas. Parents warned their daughters with his story. True crime podcasts dissected his case. But in his cell, he remained still, waiting, the date of his execution looming like a shadow he never acknowledged. The man who once walked among ordinary people had become a symbol of horror. Yet to those who met him inside those prison walls, he was not monstrous. He was calm, articulate, even gentle in manner. And that contradiction, between the mask he wore and the crimes he committed, was what made him most terrifying. The corridor of death row was a place of unnatural stillness, where the air felt heavier and the light dimmer than in the rest of the prison. The walls, thick with concrete and painted a dull institutional gray, seemed to absorb all sound. Each cell door was solid steel with only a narrow slot at eye level, framed by reinforced glass. Footsteps echoed far down the hallway, and conversations, when they occurred, were brief and formal. This was where Michelle Harper had been reassigned for the night rotation, a promotion in title but a burden in spirit. It was a place where hope had already been drained from the walls, and what remained was routine, silence, and waiting. Michelle worked the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, patrolling the corridor alone except for cameras and intercoms. Her duties were methodical, hourly checks, meal delivery through a secured tray slot, escorting medical staff when needed, and monitoring behavior logs. Death row inmates were kept isolated by policy, their privileges limited, their futures already decided. Most sat in silence, some staring blankly at the wall, others lost in endless sleep. But one of them, Daniel Rose, was different. She noticed it during her second week on the rotation. His posture was always upright. He kept his cell neat, arranging his books and bed with obsessive care. Unlike the others, he did not appear lost or broken. He met her gaze when she passed, not defiantly, but with a strange calmness. He seemed neither guilty nor innocent, just present, as if the walls had become part of him. At first, their interaction was no more than procedural. Michelle performed her duties without looking too long into the small glass window of his cell. But over time, she began to linger just a moment longer than necessary. He would stand near the door when she passed, and she could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. There was no hostility, no desperation, only patience. It was rare in that place, and it unsettled her. One night, during her rounds, she paused outside his cell. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Then, with a voice so low it was almost a whisper, he said something polite, inconsequential, a comment on the temperature of the cell block. She acknowledged it with a nod and moved on, but something about the moment clung to her. It wasn't the words, it was the tone. Calm. Controlled. human. From that point forward, their interactions deepened subtly. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was always in measured tones, offering thoughts on the books he was reading or commenting on the behavior of other inmates. Michelle began to respond. Not emotionally, not personally, just in small, impersonal observations that felt safe. It became a rhythm between them, a quiet ritual that filled the dead hours of the night. The things he said stayed with her after her shift ended. He had a way of speaking that was both articulate and restrained, like someone used to being misunderstood. She found herself thinking about their brief exchanges on her drive home, replaying his phrasing in her head. There was nothing flirtatious or inappropriate. But there was something that made her feel seen. She began to question what she thought she knew. He didn't fit the image of a killer. She had seen violent men, angry men, manipulative men in her years at the prison. But Daniel Rose didn't fit into any of those boxes. He never raised his voice, never made demands, never tried to intimidate. His demeanor was thoughtful, his presence quiet. He spoke of books and ideas, of philosophy, of the justice system, of how easily people could be misjudged. He never spoke directly of his case unless she asked, and even then, he was vague, not in avoidance, but as if reliving it brought him pain. He told her, in carefully chosen words, that the truth was not what the newspapers had claimed. That there were parts of his story no one cared to hear. That the trial had been rushed, the defense inadequate, and the public eager for a villain. Michelle listened. At first with skepticism, then with curiosity, and eventually with something closer to empathy. She told herself it was professional interest, part of the job to understand the minds of the inmates. But it wasn't that. Not anymore. In the silence of those long nights, Michelle found something unexpected. A connection formed not through touch or shared experience, but through words spoken between steel and concrete. She no longer dreaded her shift. In fact, she began to anticipate those brief exchanges, those quiet minutes outside his door where something unspoken passed between them. It was dangerous, perhaps even foolish, but she couldn't deny the comfort it brought her. She began bringing books from her own collection, sliding them into the tray slot during rounds. He thanked her without words, only a nod or a look that lingered a second too long. It wasn't against protocol, but it wasn't encouraged either. Still, she continued. It gave her purpose, a sense that her presence in that cold corridor mattered. As weeks turned into months, their quiet connection deepened. Nothing had changed outwardly. She remained the officer. He remained the inmate. But beneath the routine, beneath the silence, something had shifted. In that narrow space between the bars and the law, a bond had begun to take root, delicate, quiet, and dangerously alive. By the winter of 2009, the boundaries that had once defined Michelle Harper's work had slowly begun to erode. What started as cautious curiosity toward Daniel Rose had evolved into something more intimate, more dangerous, and far more difficult to control. Their interactions had deepened beyond small talk and procedural exchanges. In the stillness of death row, between the humming fluorescent lights and the echoing footsteps, something forbidden had taken root. Michelle's nightly rounds became longer. She lingered outside Daniel's cell not for duty, but for something she struggled to name. Their conversations, once rare and restrained, were now quietly anticipated moments, filled with philosophical musings, questions without clear answers, and the vulnerable admissions of two people who had spent too much of their lives alone. She began to time her schedule around his routine. If another officer covered her shift, she felt restless. If she passed his cell without stopping, she carried a gnawing guilt. The prison's silence had become a backdrop for something intensely personal. What unsettled Michelle most was how natural it had begun to feel. It wasn't some sudden infatuation or impulsive decision. It was a gradual slipping of lines. One night, during a storm that knocked out one of the exterior cameras, Michelle found herself guiding Daniel, under the guise of a medical escort, into an unused supply room in an older wing of the facility. It was a calculated risk, timed with precision. The room was dark, dusty, and unmonitored. There, with no metal doors between them, they stood close for the first time. It wasn't physical at first. It was a moment of breath, a pause, the soft shock of nearness. The tension that had simmered for months surfaced without words. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes held something that broke her resolve. She didn't pull away. She didn't issue commands. In the darkness, she felt something rare, a pulse, a hunger, a sense of being alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their meetings became more frequent, more carefully planned. They used that same forgotten room in the far wing, always during the dead hours of the night when the prison's rhythm slowed to near silence. Michelle manipulated schedules and falsified brief entries in the logbook to make the time. She knew every blind spot in the system, every broken camera, every supervisor's habit. It wasn't difficult for someone like her, trusted, diligent, invisible. Inside that space, they were no longer officer and inmate. There were moments of soft touch, of whispered promises, of stolen warmth. His hands, calloused and careful, trembled the first time he touched her. Her body responded not just with desire, but with a strange sense of belonging. It was wrong. It was reckless. But it felt like salvation. Daniel spoke rarely about his case, but Michelle no longer pressed. Her doubt had faded. She believed him now, believed that the system had failed him, that the man portrayed in court was not the man she knew. She told herself that monsters didn't speak the way he did, didn't read Dostoevsky, didn't whisper apologies into the curve of her neck. The contradictions no longer troubled her. They only deepened her conviction. When she missed her period, it took her days to face the truth. She bought the test during an early morning stop at a pharmacy far from her neighborhood. The result came quickly, and her hands shook when she saw it. Alone in her apartment, she sat in silence for hours, staring at the small strip of plastic that had appended everything. Her thoughts spiraled. Panic came first, then resolve. In the quiet aftermath, an idea began to form, naive, maybe, but full of hope. If she was pregnant with Daniel's child, perhaps there would be a path toward mercy. A petition. A legal motion. A reconsideration. She researched similar cases in other states, scoured forums and legal archives. She found stories, rare, scattered, but real, where the presence of a child had delayed or overturned a sentence. She clung to those examples like life rafts. She told Daniel in the dark, in their usual place. He didn't speak at first. Then, he reached for her hand and held it tightly. She imagined a future, not in that prison, but somewhere else. She saw him walking free, holding their child, a life far from the one they had both endured. It was irrational. Impossible. But it gave her purpose. From that moment on, Michelle began preparing. She kept detailed notes. She drafted letters. She sought a lawyer willing to listen. At work, she kept her composure, but her eyes revealed a quiet urgency. Each passing day brought her closer to the edge, but she no longer feared it. In her mind, they were already a family, and families fought for one another. She didn't see herself as a traitor to her duty. She saw herself as someone who had finally found something worth sacrificing for. The rules, the walls, the uniforms, none of it mattered anymore. Behind the bars and beneath the silence, she had found love. And now, she carried its proof inside her. Michelle Harper's pregnancy changed the rhythm of everything. What had once been a covert romance hidden in the shadows of a prison now took on new weight, new urgency, new risk. Every day she woke with a singular mission in mind, to save Daniel Rose from execution. She no longer moved through her shifts like a ghost. She had become purposeful, deliberate, and quietly defiant. The child growing inside her was not just a symbol of love but a potential key to unlock the prison gates, or at the very least, to delay their final closure. She began collecting every piece of documentation she could find, legal files, court transcripts, appeals that had been denied without thorough consideration. She read late into the night, highlighting lines, making notes in the margins, and drawing connections between procedural gaps and overlooked evidence. She consulted outdated legal blogs and found obscure references to cases where the existence of a child had prompted reconsideration of a sentence. Though most were unsuccessful, one or two had managed to delay executions for further review. That was all she needed: one chance, one precedent. Michelle contacted a defense attorney in Memphis, a man known for his work in capital punishment cases. She used a false name and met him under the guise of being a distant cousin of Daniel's. She laid out her case carefully, presenting Daniel not as a monster, but as a misunderstood man failed by a system eager for closure. When the attorney asked for proof of her connection to the inmate, she revealed the pregnancy. His reaction was cautious, even skeptical, but he agreed to examine the case files. Word spread faster than Michelle expected. Within weeks, prison administration noticed discrepancies in the logs she had kept, time gaps, unexplained absences, inconsistencies in surveillance reports. A quiet investigation was opened. Security footage was pulled. Patterns emerged. An officer was sent to shadow her under the pretense of staff evaluation. She felt their eyes on her, and though she tried to maintain control, the walls began to close in. She was summoned to a private meeting with the warden. The questions were firm but controlled. Had she spent unauthorized time with inmate Rose? Why had there been alterations in the access logs? Why had medical staff reported seeing her in off-limits areas? Michelle denied everything. She was calm, composed, insisting that her record spoke for itself. But beneath the surface, she knew the end was approaching. Meanwhile, her legal petition was filed. It cited humanitarian grounds for clemency, pointing to the unborn child's right to life and parental connection. The motion gained media attention after a local journalist caught wind of the unusual appeal. Headlines ran with speculation: prison guard pregnant with death row inmate's child. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some condemned her as a disgrace, others called her brave. Online forums burned with debate. Outside the prison gates, a small group of protesters arrived, holding signs both for and against her cause. Inside the facility, Michelle's position became untenable. Colleagues who once greeted her with indifference now avoided eye contact. Her supervisor stopped assigning her to death row rotations. Whispers followed her down hallways. The isolation she once embraced now turned hostile. She received a formal notice of administrative suspension pending internal review. She was barred from entering the facility. Her badge was revoked. Her keyring was taken from her hand without ceremony. Michelle returned home in silence, her world narrowed to the confines of her apartment and the sound of her child's heartbeat during clinic visits. The stress was mounting. Bills piled up. The legal process dragged. The court had yet to respond to the petition. The execution date remained unchanged. Her attorney, now more cautious than optimistic, began to pull away from the case. With no new evidence, the pregnancy alone wasn't enough. Her hope, once fierce and blinding, began to dim. One morning, a letter arrived from the Department of Corrections. It was brief and absolute: she had been terminated from her position for gross misconduct and ethical violations. There would be no severance. No appeal. Her reputation was dismantled in a single paragraph. The child's father remained behind steel doors, the execution clock still ticking. She had bet everything on a system that had no place for compassion or exceptions. Michelle's final attempt was a televised interview. A local channel offered her a chance to speak directly to the public. She sat beneath harsh studio lights, her hands folded over her rounded belly, and tried to explain what the world refused to understand. She spoke not of crimes or policies, but of humanity, of love found in an unexpected place, and the hope that justice could make room for mercy. The response was overwhelming, and ultimately irrelevant. 2 weeks later, the court denied her petition without comment. No delay. No reconsideration. The system had spoken. With no job, no legal recourse, and a child on the way, Michelle found herself alone. Social services intervened. A caseworker, citing her unstable financial and legal situation, filed a motion to remove custody upon birth. She fought it. She screamed into courtrooms. But the facts against her were unshakable. When her son was born, she held him for 43 minutes before he was taken from her arms. The room went quiet afterward. No visitors. No flowers. Just a mother in a hospital gown staring at an empty bassinet. Michelle Harper had stood against a machine she couldn't move. And in the end, it crushed her. The winter of 2010 settled over Little Rock with a stillness that mirrored Michelle Harper's own quiet undoing. The world outside moved forward, cars drifted over slushy roads, store windows blinked with holiday lights, and people went about their routines with no knowledge of the private collapse taking place behind closed doors. Michelle's apartment, once a sanctuary of ritual and solitude, had become a hollow shell. The baby was gone. Her job was gone. The man she had risked everything for was still behind concrete walls, waiting for the needle that would silence him forever. After the state took her child, Michelle remained in the hospital under observation. Her vitals were stable, but her mind drifted between numbness and despair. When she was discharged, there was no one waiting for her. No ride, no welcome, no homecoming. She walked out into the gray afternoon cold with a hospital bag and a folder of court papers, her name printed in bold at the top. The state had deemed her unfit. Her parental rights were terminated within weeks. Her son was placed into temporary care, and within months, a couple from another part of the state adopted him. She never saw his face again. The decision shattered something fundamental in her. Not all at once, but in slow, irreversible stages. Michelle tried to fight, to appeal, to ask for supervised visitation or even a single letter. But every door she knocked on remained shut. Her past, her choices, and the scandal that clung to her name followed her into every courtroom and legal office. Judges saw her as a woman who had betrayed her duty. Social workers referred to her only as the former corrections officer. Even charitable organizations turned her away. Her story had reached the wrong people in the wrong way, and now it branded her like a scar. Daniel Rose's fate was sealed. Despite her efforts, despite the legal petition and public plea, the court had refused to grant clemency. On a damp morning in March, he was executed by lethal injection. Michelle was not permitted to attend. She received the news secondhand from a sympathetic journalist who had followed the case. The article was short. It listed his crimes, the location of the execution, and the final statement he gave, which was brief and impersonal. There was no mention of her. No acknowledgement of the child. Just a date and a death. In the days that followed, Michelle stopped answering the phone. She unplugged the television and closed the blinds. Her apartment became a tomb of still air and dim corners. The books on her shelves gathered dust. Toby, her old beagle, wandered from room to room with no rhythm to follow. Food spoiled in the fridge. Stacks of unopened mail accumulated by the door. Her body moved out of habit, but her spirit had gone quiet. Her old colleagues avoided her. Some out of pity, others out of shame, but most out of fear that proximity to her would damage their own reputations. At the grocery store, she was met with stares. At church, she was gently asked not to return. The world no longer had space for her. Her choices, whatever their intent, had left her untouchable. She applied for jobs, dozens of them. No one called back. Her name triggered alerts. The scandal was embedded in online searches. Employers saw a woman with a record, not of crime, but of controversy. A woman who had crossed a line few understood and fewer forgave. She sold what little she had, her car, her mother's jewelry, the furniture in her guest room. Rent payments became late, then missed. Eventually, she was evicted. She packed what remained into 2 plastic tubs and left the building with a quiet nod to the landlord. Shelters took her in, briefly. She never stayed long. There were too many eyes, too many whispers. She drifted through temporary housing, lived on the edge of bus stations and public libraries, wrote letters she never mailed. Letters to her son, filled with apologies, stories, dreams. She imagined he would one day read them, that maybe a file would find its way into his hands, and he would know that his mother hadn't vanished without reason. But reality offered no such comfort. The months stretched into years. Michelle aged in ways she hadn't expected, her face sharpened, her back curved, and her silence deepened. No one called her by name anymore. She existed in fragments, the woman who used to be, the woman who disappeared, the woman whose story was told only in whispers. There were moments, late at night, when she stood at the edge of the Arkansas River, watching the water move endlessly forward. She wondered what it would have felt like to hold her child again. To be forgiven. To start over. But those thoughts were fleeting, drowned by the weight of her past. Michelle Harper had entered the prison as a guard. She had left as a cautionary tale. Her love, her loyalty, her defiance had cost her everything. In the end, she had no home, no family, no redemption, only memory, and the ache of what could never be undone.